I have struggled for a really long time to know how to make this video. You may be wondering right off the bat whether or not the title is clickbait, and it's not, but it is in a really weird way. You see, my indie game was ruined and it was a devastating experience, but I kept going. Now, for those of you who don't know, I have been developing an indie trading card game since around 2020, 2021, and it is getting very, very close to being ready to share with you all. But I ran into a problem while I was developing the game, and it is something that just almost took the joy out of it for me completely. I almost gave up on the project as a whole. You see, I am used to facing adversity when it comes to working on this project. I'm used to facing roadblocks. If it's not one thing, it's the other, and that's not me complaining. That's just life, right? That's just one of those things that you have to get used to, is adversity. And I feel like through most of it, I have thrived. I've enjoyed overcoming and figuring out new and interesting solutions. Whether or not I am personally in a great place, I always try my best to push forward. There are sacrifices that I've made and things that I've given up in the process of trying to create this game that I don't even know where to start on. There were days where I didn't have enough money to eat because I put everything that I had into this dream and into this passion that I had in order to bring it into fruition. So with all of that in mind, it begs the question, what would be enough? What could be enough to ruin my indie game? Well, this story starts in late 2022, early 2023, somewhere around that time period, when I had made the decision to switch the Summoner's Nexus TCG from a 3D digital card game to a 2D one. I was still very green and still figuring out the ropes when it came to managing a project of this potential scale. And so I was hiring devs on Fiverr for the first time and figuring out exactly what I wanted the project to look like. And it was looking good. We had been working on the shop system and we were about to start working on the deck editor. Things were coming together in a meaningful way. I had the art design and the cards had been put into the app, and I was so optimistic. I didn't know how much further there would be to go, but I was very happy with the progress we had made. Now, at this point, I had probably already invested a good couple £1,000s into the game's development, be it for actual development, art design, sound design, any number of things. So I was not necessarily in the best place financially. I was working on a teacher's salary. I had been creating content on my YouTube channel as a full-time job for a while, but I'd given that up, one, for some personal reasons, and two, so that I would have enough to consistently work on this project and devote everything that I could to it. So while my resources weren't abundant, they were consistent, and that was enough to see me through up until a certain point. You see, the main team that I had been working with was aware of the fact that my budget wasn't necessarily excellent, but we had managed to sort of, scrape by on what we had. Now, this isn't to say that I was paying them peanuts, mind you. The rates were still, like I said, in the thousands. It's just, I was only working on the project incrementally, and there were limits because of the budget that I had. Now, we developed this project to a point where it had a functioning shop system, which I designed from the ground up with different rates and different banners and different pulls. I did like 56 pages of math calculations for exactly how every element of the shop should work, and then the deck editor and the designs that went into that, and so on and so forth. And so the code for the game had gotten very complex, and I mean very complex. It had gotten to the point that no other dev team, no other developer really wanted to touch it with a 9-foot pole, because in order to code something, you have to understand what's been put in place. Most teams that I encountered would rather start fresh on their own project rather than try and take the reins from a team that was already working on something. And this is where the problem started to begin, because it meant that I was at a stage where I very much needed the current team of developers to keep on working in order for the app to get from where it was to its completion. Now, since this relationship, I've since reconnected with this developer and we are on much better terms. We have a very good working relationship, and we are able to coexist in a way that is beneficial to both of us. But at the time, things were a little bit more volatile, and well, I've had friends and family come to this conclusion, and I myself had come to this conclusion at one point as well, but I've since gone back and tried to view things more through a lens of, let's call it good faith. But the team, after finishing a very important milestone, a milestone that really increased complexity of the code to a point where they became indisposable, asked for an increase in the rate that I was paying them. And it wasn't a 10% increase, 15%, a 20% increase. The rate that they proposed for the next milestone was literally double what I had been paying up until that point. And this was financially, or it would have been financially devastating if I had accepted it. I couldn't have accepted it because I didn't have that kind of money, but I was in a position where it was either go with them or start from scratch because no one wanted to pick up where they had left off. So whether they intended to or not, they put me in a position where I was deadlocked. I either had to accept this much higher rate or just give up on the project. Now, for a while, I just didn't know what to do. I'll be completely honest with you. I felt like giving up because there was no negotiation that I could do. We weren't on the greatest of terms at this point because there were a lot of complaints, because oftentimes they might be working on a section of the project and maybe it takes longer than expected, but I had paid a specific amount for a given feature to be completed. So I can get it from their perspective, where it's like, okay, to make sure if the development takes longer than we initially expect, we want to get paid for that time. Whereas for me as a buyer, it's I want to pay you for the specific function to get that function working. But whatever our individual reasonings, it made it so that we were butting heads a lot. So it's not even like they were willing to negotiate or come to the table. It was a hard rate that I had been given. And like I said, I initially I wanted to lay down and die. I asked my friends, I asked people who I knew who could code, I asked other developers whether or not they'd be willing to pick up from where the project had been left off, and everyone told me that it just wasn't feasible, it wasn't viable, but I didn't have the resources or the heart to start over. So that was the story for a little bit. I don't remember how long it was because honestly that period of time is a blur in my memory, but what I do remember is not wanting to give up. And so I looked everywhere I could, to the point where it actually took me back to my dad and an offer that he had made to me previously. You see, at the time, my dad and I were on awkward terms, but he lives in Nigeria. He has a company he runs from Nigeria, and one of the things that they do is hiring and outsourcing. So what I decided to do was take him up on an offer that he had made to me previously, where they could put out a recruitment ad in Nigeria to try and find someone to come on and work for me full time rather than as a freelancer. Now, that was something that honestly is a great thing. It's an extremely generous thing, and I'm not going to get too much into like my family matters here. It's just at first I didn't want to take him up on the offer on principle, but I reached my lowest point at that point. So I took it. I was like, you know what? I need something. I need to see the other side of this. Me and my dad are on great terms now, by the way. Like, things have skyrocketed in our relationship since then. And to be honest, we were on an upward trend at the time. It's just this specifically was a point of contention. But I took him up on his offer. They put out a recruitment campaign for game developers. I did some interviews. I tried to hire someone. And in truth, I didn't really like any of the people who they had brought forward for me to interview. So I started looking myself as well. And I found someone in Nigeria who I thought would be a good fit. He didn't want the job. He couldn't take it because he was already busy with something, but he referenced a friend, and so I had that friend go through my dad's company for the hiring process, and I got myself a full-time game developer. Because of the exchange rates between home and the UK, I could afford to hire him full-time. And what that sort of allowed me to do was expand my horizons for what could be done, because yeah, maybe other developers might not want to tackle this project because it's already too complex. But if I hire you and say, hey, it's your full-time job to learn this code, understand it, and be able to make changes to it, well, the story starts to look a little bit different then, doesn't it? But we were running into an issue, and that was sort of a technical skill gap. You see, game development in Nigeria isn't like this massive industry. It's a very fledgling space. And so there were some skills that this newfound member of my team was lacking. We did everything we could to try and bridge the gap, to get him to edit the code, to get the code to be able to work, but he just, for the life of him, could not get the app to work. He couldn't get the code to respond. And so on my last legs, I decided that we would just start from scratch. Now, he recommended that we use an engine, and we started putting that together, but it wasn't I don't even know what words to put to it. It's just knowing what we had, starting fresh and seeing something that wasn't nearly as good. It hurt a lot, and there was just a lot of frustration when we couldn't get the engines that we tried to work the way that I needed them to work. Now, my developer kept on trying. He kept on looking into the code to see what was wrong and why he couldn't access the previous team's work, why he couldn't build off of it. And eventually he realized something. The code that team had given me was incomplete. I had paid them and I had given them everything in terms of the resources for what they had done up until then, but they had left out the library for the game's code. That is where all of the information is housed that the rest of the app and the code responds to. I just didn't have it, and so as a result of that, nothing that they had done up until then was accessible to me. It was completely broken. It was then that the gears started turning, and again, I can see how it could be viewed as sabotage, but I prefer to look at things in good faith. I had a member of the team who I was still in contact with. We were on good terms, and I asked him, hey, this is missing from the code. Can you explain that? And what his explanation was that the library was just too big to include in the files that they had sent me. And while I wanted to challenge that and say, well, why didn't you tell me that there was something missing that I wouldn't be able to work without? I decided to leave it and just ask, okay, well, is there a way you can send me the library? We did some talking, and eventually he was able to get me a code that gave me access to the full library. Now, genuinely, in hindsight, I think that they had just expected me to cave and come back to them and accept their higher price, which might be why they didn't initially give me everything that I needed to work with someone else. They just didn't see it as being realistic or reasonably feasible. So when I came asking for the library, I think they were actually a little bit surprised. So I took this library and we started trying to work again, but for whatever reason, I do think it was, let's not say whatever reason, there was a bit of a skill difference between my developer at the time. He's improved so much now, but at the time, he did not have the skill, even with the library, to build on their code. He couldn't connect the library to anything new he wanted to do. And it was like that for a few months. We were struggling to figure out a way forward, but I refused to give up. And this is when I ended up reaching out to a friend, Seluxus, Tyler, from Discord. And the reason why I hadn't reached out to him before is because he had been trying to help me with the game before I even reached out to a developer on Fiverr. But because of his full-time job, he just wasn't able to commit to it fully. And so it hadn't even really crossed my mind at the time to ask him to take a look at it. When he did take a look at it, though, he was able to figure out how to connect the existing library to new code that we wanted to build. And from that moment, I'll never forget where I was. I was walking down my street. There's a footpath that you can take through a little forest, and him explaining that he knows what to do, he knows how to bridge the gap. I feel like that conversation changed my life, because for the first time in months, I saw a way forward. I saw a way to the conclusion of the game that just didn't exist until that moment. And it was so many things that needed to come together. We needed to get David so that he could realize that the library was missing. I needed to have that link to the person in the team who was able to get me the library. I needed Tyler to be able to recognize what he needed to do to bridge the code, and then teach David how to do the same thing so that we could start building again and take that first step forward, the first step forward that we had taken in months. And that step forward did something, right? Because my team, Tyler and David, between them, in truth, they still didn't have the necessary skills to complete the game, unfortunately. And we tried having them do it, right? I even tried to bring Tyler on full time for a little bit, and it just didn't work. But what that first step did was, it showed that we had bargaining power. It showed that this was not the only option. The initial team that we worked on was not the only option, and that no matter what, I would find a way forward. And so the initial team that I had worked with, I reached out to them again and I said, hey, we've moved forward since, we left off, but there are a few things here and there that I might want you to work on. Are you interested? And they took that, right? They jumped at the rate that we gave for it, and they agreed to work on that small section at an agreeable rate. And I was happy to have them back on it in a measured sense, just to make sure we hadn't built that trust back up yet, but they came back on. And eventually, little by little, at a rate that I was happy to agree to, they started taking over more aspects of the development until they were the lead team on the project again. I never had my guys stop touching it, so that at any point in time, if they needed to, they could move forward on it. But now I'm working with that team again, and at first I felt so frustrated because I felt like it was so much wasted time. Maybe I should have just taken their higher offer, and so on and so forth. And it was my dad who actually explained to me the benefit of that time that I took away, the benefit of those months where I didn't make any progress. He explained that no, I did make progress because I showed that no matter what, I didn't need anyone in order to complete the game. And when I say I don't need anyone, I don't mean that I don't need help. I mean that there's no one person who could hold me hostage and force me to accept their standards, which meant that I spent that time accumulating bargaining power, right? I didn't make developmental progress, but I made progress in that aspect, which is also very important. It's the more business aspect of the game's development. And that is what made it so that I could take more steps forward and get to where we are today. I wanted to give up so many times. It felt like everything was breaking, nothing was working together. Every time we tried a new engine or a new piece of code or just a new anything, everything fell apart, and it was so disheartening. But I just felt like I had to keep going. This is everything that I wanted. This is why I woke up in the morning, right? This is why I was excited to get up. No one had to tell me to go work on this game. No one had to tell me to work on these projects. It's something that I wanted for myself, and that dedication paid off in a very big way, in that I was able to find a way forward after the game was ruined. And I guess I'm sharing this story now, and I've never really shared the full story before, because maybe you have a project that it feels like has just been blown up or is falling apart for reasons beyond your control. Maybe you feel like you're almost out of options. Well, I would encourage you to keep going, because you never know what you find on the other side of it. You never know. It could be anything. It could be something random. It could be just one conversation. One moment could flip everything on its head, and suddenly now you're moving again. So I would encourage you not to give up. And thank you for listening to my story and for being here to support what the game is today, because it means the world to me. Well, that's everything I had to say. So have a wonderful day and take care, friends. Bye.